Michael's got a real breadth of interest and experience in what's a long and distinguished career. And I think when we were chatting the other day, what really struck me is the number of areas of innovation that Michael has contributed towards, taking his research into practice. But I think as the talk today will discuss, things aren't always quite as simple as a linear projection from starting to achieving excellence in research. Along the way, there are challenges, but there are also we need to think about how the research we're taking into practice is benefiting patients or not. And that's really, I think, the theme of today's lecture. So without further ado, welcome Professor Michael Baum for this first lecture in our series from NCITA. Thank you very much, Professor Baum.
Thanks, Jameson, for your kind introduction. I feel really honoured to kick off this series of lectures. I look upon myself as a very small giant, in fact. I'm about to share my screen with you. Now, this is a lovely slide. There are several versions of this. All the great famous scientists from Galileo to Tim Berners-Lee's in a line. They're not completely correct in date order, but it's charming. So where do I fit in as a giant? Well, the bottom right-hand corner, obviously, and this is me on the shoulder of my giant. If only. There it is. Now, that's my mother, and that's me as a baby. My mother was a giant, even of small stature, because she had 5 children and looked after us through the war, Second World War, and the austerity afterwards. Also, she was so warm-hearted that many times during the war, we had refugees sleeping in the attic. So she was an extraordinarily courageous woman who never took time off for herself. Here's a picture of the family. That's me when I was 11 years old. My mother and father, my other brothers, and my little sister. My mother, Mary, developed breast cancer in her mid-60s. And when I say developed it, she presented with metastases throughout the skeleton, and she was in agony. And the treatment failed to control her agony and led to all her beautiful hair falling out. That made me very, very angry, although I don't know why I was angry on something as abstract as cancer. But in many ways, this kicked off my career. I was qualified at that time and just a senior lecturer in surgery in Cardiff. And I decided I would devote my career to try and spare the suffering of my mother. 27 years ago, my sister Linda developed breast cancer, and it was caught early, quote, unquote, 27 years ago. 2 years ago, she developed distant metastases out of the blue, and she's on treatment for metastatic disease, which is a good, more humane. So there you've got 2 extremes in a way. And if anything, anybody out there can explain breast cancer to me, they don't understand it. How can you get distant metastases from a breast cancer 25 years later? And this is not a unique phenomena. And I'll end up with that, coming back to that point. Let me emphasize, screening is sieving. It's just the word for sieving. We're going to talk about using mammography. Now, I also chaired the national trial of prostate cancer screening, but that was using blood tests, PSA blood tests. So this is what we're discussing, screening by mammography. Now, whatever the methodology of screening, you have to be alert to the biases. Lead time bias that prolongs the period of observation, length bias, which demonstrates that screening is good at detecting good cancers, and the attendance bias, whilst attenders are different to those who do not attend, who do not accept the invitation. Let me explain what these are. Let's look at lead time bias. Imagine this is an age range. The cancer starts that age, clinically detectable that age, and the patient dies of metastatic disease there. Now, let's look at two frames. The conventional frame is you pick up the disease when it's clinically apparent, and the patient in this example lives 15 years. But if you expand the frame like that and pick up preclinical cancers, then it looks as if the patient is living 30 years from diagnosis. That is called a lead time bias. So you must not use survival rates because survival rates will always go up because of lead time bias. So I'll explain what we have to in a moment. What do we use? Then there's the length bias. Screening is good at catching good cancers. So here we have trawlers trawling the fishing lanes, and they pass by every 3 years. They collect the slow-growing fish, but in that period, the interval, the fast-growing fish jump out the water. So when you analyze screening, you have to analyze the outcome of all those who were invited, whether or not they attended. And then the same with attendance bias. The people who accept attenders and non-attenders are different. Non-attenders tend to be of a lower social class, and stage for stage, breast cancer in lower classes has a worse prognosis. So you have to take all invitees and include all cancers, whether or not they're diagnosed by screening or clinically. And here's just an illustration of affluent versus deprived 5-year survival rates using class alone for breast cancer. Why this is the case is a different story, but this is a real problem and we haven't yet dealt with it adequately. So because of that, the only way of evaluating screening is randomized controlled trials, and the outcome measures, primary outcome measures, would be cause-specific mortality, not survival. I'm sick and tired of writing letters and criticizing papers claiming how screening improves survival. Well, of course it does. The secondary endpoint should be all-cause mortality, particularly, as I will show later on, the toxicity that can be downline as a result of screening, unpredicted toxicity. There is a hypothetical mathematical model that underpins screening for breast cancer. And the assumption is that the cancers start as duct carcinoma in situ and grow to be node negative invasive cancers, grow to be node positive invasive cancers, and it's a linear or log linear phenomena, mathematical model that explains that outcome. So the screening theory can be summarized like this. catch it early, save a life, and along the way, save the breast. So the assumption is that increased detection of early cancer leads to a fall of the incidence of late cancer. More in situ cancer detected less invasive cancer. Smaller cancers, as a result of screening, lead to fewer mastectomies, and also, in the same way of argument, fewer node positive than node negative cases. So that will impact on mortality. Now, in 1987, we had the breast cancer screening report when Margaret Thatcher was Prime Minister. And this was written by Patrick Forrest, Professor Sir Patrick Forrest from Edinburgh University. A very nice man. I was very friendly with him. And to begin with, I agreed with everything he said, but along the way, we parted company. Now, the Forrest report in 1987, using available data, which was very limited at that time, there were 2 clinical trials and some observation studies. Both clinical trials were flawed, but they summed up to be a 25% reduction in cause-specific mortality, or hazard rate of 0.75. I was very, very impressed with that number, could hardly deny it. And I was sucked in to the system. And as I was a good friend of Sir Patrick Forrest, I was given the task of setting up the first of 3 pilot screening units in the country. My unit, when I was professor at King's College Hospital, was set up in Camberwell, and we called it Butterfly Walk. That was the name of the shopping centre. So in 1988, myself as Professor of Surgery there, plus Professor of Radiology, Professor of Social Health, we set up the first screening centre. I was very proud. It opened on time, on budget, and you judge from that, I had a huge investment in this process. I wanted it to work. At 10 years, or 8 to 10 years later, we decided to assess the outcomes. And what about increased detection of duct carcinoma in situ? And we have 3 groups here: too young to be screened, too old to be screened, those that are screened. And this is what we saw: a huge increase in the detection of duct carcinoma in situ. Great, that proves the first part of the theory of screening. Next, cancer detection. These are the group too young, too old, and we would obviously assume with all the duct carcinoma in situ, 20% of the cases were duct carcinoma in situ, we would see the fall in the incidence of invasive cancer. We didn't. We saw a rise in the incidence of breast cancer as a result of screening, with more node-negative cases than before. I thought we'd done something very wrong here, but others came along and confirmed these observations. Then we looked at the mastectomy rates, which were assumed to be go down. We got all the increased incidence of duct carcinoma in situ, and clearly that would reduce the mastectomy rate. Well, it didn't, because something like half of the cases of duct carcinoma in situ were multifocal. Now, that's an interesting side issue, because invasive cancers are rarely multifocal. They can be, but rare, whereas duct carcinoma in situ are commonly multicentric and end up having more mastectomies. Now, that seems absolutely impossible, can't be right. Yet again, Baum was screwed up, but this was confirmed very similar time by Mike Dixon in Edinburgh, involved with the Edinburgh screening program. And this is what he saw, same period of time, increase in the incidence of DCIS, increase in the incidence of mastectomy. So screening the population does not reduce the incidence of mastectomy. But in spite of that, long before these data became available, the lay public were coerced, and I use the word carefully. They weren't invited, they were coerced to attend for screening. To be sensible, good people, they ought to be screening. They even came up with a super special cartoon version of the breast screening for women with learning difficulties. Again, coercing such women to turn up for screening. Well, it wasn't long before we found out the problems. I noticed on the list of people popping up that Gil Welch is there. If you're there, Dr. Welch, I'm thrilled. You are one of my heroes, and you appear in this wonderful paper. I think it was published in the New England Journal in 2009 or 2010. A lovely title, Screening Mammography, a Long Run for a Short Slide. Well, you'd only understand that if you played that strange game, rounders, I think they call it, or baseball in America. And I just want to show this paper, this picture, the table, top right-hand corner. And I'm going to enlarge it because this, to me, says it all. And it says it all with incredible clarity. Using all the available data, Dr. Welch came with this bottom line: screening mammography of 2,500 women who are 50 years of age. One woman might benefit from avoid dying of breast cancer. 1,000 women will have false alarms, and breast cancer will be overdiagnosed in 5 to 15 women who were then treated needlessly with surgery, radiation, chemotherapy, and combination. Gil, if you're there, I'll take my hat off. The word got out now because this was just one of a whole cluster of papers that were beginning to seriously challenge screening. And here's the BMJ, breast screening, what the leaflets doesn't tell you. That was Journal of the Royal Society of Medicine, 2010. Has breast screening saved lives? And their conclusion was no. And here's the BMJ editorials. In America, they were questioning an independent US panel fans debate on mammography. Now, we're going back here to 2009, 2010. This is 12 years ago, and still we're having this debate. And I'm getting too old. I'm getting tired, and I've had enough of it. At that time, I think 2012, the newspapers decided to take on this challenge. And this was the Times, the top people's newspaper, the one I take, which says, keep having scans despite the downsides, women are told. And there were 3 women who claimed that screening saved their lives. And it's very difficult. I can't even bring myself to challenge a woman who claims that screening saved their lives. It would be cruel. I allow them to believe that, even though I don't think it's true. Now, at the same time, the Daily Mail invited me. Now, the Daily Mail is a very interesting paper. It's the most popular paper that women read in the United Kingdom. And I, to screen or not to screen, and here I'm saying why I don't think it works, and I'm already going to say that. And here we have only one patient who is regretting that she has screening. That's maybe the first. But there are now more and more women and campaigning women and campaigning organizations who have caught on that women are being coerced and are being denied an informed choice. So the downsides of screening are the false alarms, overdiagnosis, I'll come back to that in a minute, and as a result of overdiagnosis, overtreatment by unnecessary surgery, increased mastectomy rate, and so on. Now, here is another paper, around about the same time as Gil Welch's, by Jorgensen in the BMJ, which beautifully illustrates this phenomena of overdiagnosis. Here we have the green line are too young to be screened. The blue line are too old to be screened. The red line is the group between 50 and 64 who are screened. And these are the rates before screening, and these are the rates one starts screening. And immediately it leaps up and doesn't come down again. And this increase in incidence that starts immediately, screening starts in a population, is of the order of 30%. I know that Gil Welch's paper says that overall it's 30%, but if it's just looking at screen detected, it's closer to 50%. So a very large proportion of women are overdiagnosed at the time of mammographic screening. Here's a picture of duct carcinoma in situ, and this is the Cochrane report, around about the time, we're talking about 2009, 2010, when everyone was beginning to catch on. The Cochrane report, based in Denmark, Copenhagen, independently reviews the data of any subject and summarizes it. And analyzing all the data, the Cochrane report estimated that for every breast cancer death avoided, 10 women are overdiagnosed and treated for breast cancer. So that is an independent meta-analysis of all the available data. Now, as far as toxicity is concerned, remember, something like 30% of screen detected women are having surgery, radiotherapy, and chemotherapy. Radiotherapy is very toxic. And here there are very many papers. This is the Lancet meta-analysis of the radiotherapy for breast cancer. And this describes the hazards of radiotherapy, a significant excess in deaths from irradiated, non-breast cancer mortality in irradiated women, ratio 1.12. So it's a kind of 12% increase in the risk of non-breast cancer irradiation from radiotherapy. And here, just to explain why that might happen, is another paper from the Red Journal, going back some time, that looking at myocardial perfusion, and myocardial perfusion changes in patients irradiated for left-sided breast cancer, correlation with coronary artery distribution, and it happens very, very quickly. Within 6 months of having radiotherapy for breast cancer, you can expect some evidence of myocardial damage. Now, in 2013, I took it upon myself to summarize all this in a review for the British Medical Journal, entitled "Harms from Breast Cancer Screening Outweigh Benefits if Deaths Caused by Treatment Included." And here are the numbers for 10,000 women over 10 years, 4 breast cancer deaths are avoided. For every breast cancer death avoided, 3 women are overdiagnosed, and 12 women will have unnecessary radiation. And the relative risk for death from radiation from MI 1.27 and deaths from lung cancer 1.72. So that summarizes it all. Now, these data that I've just described have been developed into decision aids for women invited for screening. And here we have women 50 years older, mammographic screening for 10 to 11 years. And for these are 1,000 women. So how many die from breast cancer, the benefits? Without screening, 5, with screening, 4. So that's 1 per 1,000 breast cancer death avoided. Now, I want to emphasize that this is a 20% relative risk reduction versus 5, 20% relative risk reduction. And that's damned relative risks, which are promoting breast cancer screening rather than absolute numbers. Now, again, I'll show you another version of the decision aid, not having screening. These women in red had breast cancer, 5 of them die. Women who screened, these women have breast cancer, the same number, and 4 of them die, 20% relative risk reduction. But the downside are those green dots, false alarms, unnecessary biopsies, and the 5 blue dots there, women having unnecessary toxic treatment because they were overdiagnosed. And as a result of that, you end up with a zero-sum game. With every 1 breast cancer death avoided, there's 1 extra death from other causes. So revisiting screening theory, catch it early, DCIS, smaller cancers. The experiment has failed, a worthy experiment, but we must at this point say it has failed. And unless we do that, then all these women who died have died in vain. So we have a failed experiment. And this is where I inject just a little bit of scientific philosophy. I'm a Popperian. I was a friend of Karl Popper. I gave the Karl Popper Memorial Lecture at the London School of Economics about 15 years ago. And his pathway is that you have observations, thesis, antithesis, experiment. The experiments are set up in order to falsify your beliefs. With the falsification, you come up with a revised thesis, which is compared with a new antithesis, experiment, falsification. This is the infinitum process of science. It's a never-ending quest, and that was the title of his autobiography, Never Ending Test. So, screening has failed. Can we come up with explanations? Well, very, very simply, breast cancer does not exist as a spheroid of cancer cells that grow exponentially. That's not breast cancer. Breast cancer exists as an organelle, a complex organelle, which, as well as cancer cells, has vascular cells, has inflammatory cells, and so on. And it takes a variety of steps just to get into the circulation, and then some more steps to get into the metastatic focus. But again, in the metastatic niche, it is also develops into a complex organelle with stromal cells, inflammatory cells, as well as tumor cells. So the model, mathematical model, is completely linear, whereas in reality, it's not, it's non-linear. So duct carcinoma in situ can completely regress, or can remain in the breast and picked up as an overdiagnosis, or it might progress to an invasive cancer. The invasive cancer could just stay there later. These overdiagnosed cases are not just DCIS, but they're small node negative cancers, or it may progress. So at each level, there's a variety of directions it can take, and that is what we call chaos theory. We're dealing with a non-linear biological phenomena. Let's see if I can illustrate this with a cartoon. All right, that's duct carcinoma in situ. And it can hang around for a while and it could regress, or it might progress. It gets vascularization and grows. And then it can stabilize and just sit there as a latent cancer, or some other trigger later on may get it to progress. And the cells escape and form themselves into a metastasis, which then, when disturbed, a long time in the future, in the short future, in my sister's case, 25 years before these latent foci in the skeleton became apparent. This has a better, I'm not saying it's true, but it's a better explanatory value to what we use to justify screening. So screening does not work. It is based on a false hypothesis. Let's carry on screening. Well, I say the experiment has failed. We need another giant to carry the ball. I'm worn out, I'm exhausted. My generation who worked so hard with this, so we're in our 70s or 80s, I'm 85 next month, it's terrifying. So I'm a small giant, desperate to pass it on to another smaller giant. And here's my smaller giant. This is mini me. It needn't be mini me. None of my children or grandchildren are interested in this subject, but many of the young PhD students or young academics have had my brainwashing, and I'm witnessing around the world interest in pursuing the argument, the case, why doesn't screening work? And I'll leave the last word of my talk to Karl Popper from his book, The Logic of Scientific Discovery. It is not truisms that science unveils, rather it is part of the greatness and the beauty of science that we can learn through our own critical investigations that the world is utterly different from what we imagined. And that, ladies and gentlemen, I think applies to the mathematical model trying to explain the nature of breast cancer. Thank you.